I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. Mayor deBlasio outlined his agenda for New York City in his State of the City address. He has some ambitious plans, but what can he really deliver? We'll talk to a pair of New York Times reporters. Recreational marijuana now legal in 10 states, New York and New Jersey racing to get in on the act, but are serious risks of pot being ignored? You'll hear from the author of a new book who says they are. Later on in Coda, I'll have some thoughts on the passing of the great Times columnist Russell Baker. But we begin with an extraordinary time in American politics, with a wildly unconventional president blowing up norms almost daily. There are also a historic number of women in the new Congress with their own agenda and the determination to fight for it. How is the surge of women members of Congress affecting the power dynamics in Washington? This exchange between the president and Speaker Nancy Pelosi in December gives us some insight.
Nancy's in a situation where it's not easy for her to talk right now, and I understand that, and I fully understand that. We're going to have a good discussion, and we're going to see what happens. But we have to have border security.
Mr. President, please don't characterize the strength that I bring to this meeting as the leader of the House Democrats who just won a big victory.
Let's talk about it with Susan Chira, senior correspondent and editor for gender issues at the New York Times. She was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for coverage of workplace sexual harassment. Susan, does it make a difference that Nancy Pelosi is there as the Speaker in the House, not a woman president, but a woman particularly now in a very powerful position?
Yes, I think it does. Partly, I mean, the last time she was Speaker, she was not facing a man like Donald Trump, who, during his campaign, uttered a stream of misogynistic and sexist taunts of women's appearance, of women's capacities, and even in the infamous Hollywood Access tape where he boasted about forcing himself on women. So you have a completely different counterpart here. And Nancy Pelosi has already shown that it is quite a danger to underestimate her political skills. You know, she grew up as the daughter of, the mayor of Baltimore, and
Baltimore's a tough town.
Baltimore's a tough town, and I think that one thing that's been interesting is, even in that clip, it shows you that the president was, in a way, trying to cut Nancy Pelosi out of the conversation. Chuck Schumer was there, the minority leader in the Senate, and he kept trying to talk to Chuck, and Nancy, if you will, kept cutting in and reasserting her right to be talking to him in the conversation. And I think it made President Trump uncomfortable because he wasn't used to this kind of forceful pushback.
Am I right that Nancy Pelosi seems to be more of a presence than Chuck Schumer in these situations? Or is that because she is representing a majority and Chuck Schumer, in effect, a minority?
Yeah, I mean, I do believe, as she said, she comes with, the House having won what turned out to be a really decisive victory, even though at the beginning it looked smaller. But, 40 seats or so, big Democratic margin. So she has the wind at her back. And Senator Schumer is the minority leader in the Senate and so has less power to wield vis-a-vis the president. But I would say that what Speaker Pelosi has been doing is very interesting, because I think she's taunting him a little bit, jabbing at him here and there. She coined the Trump shutdown in that conversation. You could see President Trump kind of get wound up about that. And then in this latest back and forth about whether he would be invited to speak before Congress to deliver the State of the Union, she lobbed that, while the government shutdown was going on, she essentially was saying, I won't invite you. And then he goes back and says, that's ridiculous, I'm coming. And she says, no, you're not. And then he tweets last night, it's her prerogative, which was just a fascinating back and forth. He had to concede that there were separation of powers, and that was in her ballpark.
Unless he holds it somewhere else. Or,
Yes, which, well, he doesn't. He suggested in the tweet that he wasn't going to look for an alternative site.
right.
Who knows?
And in fact, you could deliver the message, I guess, not in person. The
could,
Constitution says
absolutely.
you only have to deliver it. Susan, you wrote about the fact that there are two competing narratives going on. We've got lots of women in Congress now and women running for president, including Kirsten Gillibrand of New York. The midterm gains, the diversity that this Congress now has encouraged more women. On the other hand, as you pointed out, there's a risk involved in running against Trump. Democrats are looking for the strongest candidate. Is there a risk in running a woman, or is that a totally unfair metric?
What my colleague Lisa Lara and I were writing about was there's unease among some Democrats that since the passionate desire of Democrats is to beat Donald Trump, I think there's been a quiet discussion going on about is there more of a risk? And I actually, frankly, am not sure that there is. Some people feel, okay, Hillary Clinton was defeated, and gender was, I believe, part of that, but not the only explanation for that.
And of course, she did win the popular vote.
Indeed, so she got votes, just not in the Electoral College in the right places. But the counter argument to the risk argument is that, in fact, the energy that propelled the House victories was driven by women as volunteers, as donors, as candidates, and a diversity of women. And they have provided a lot of the energy and attention in the opening days of Congress. So there could be, because women proved themselves to be a very potent political force this time, an advantage to nominating a woman.
One of the things you've written about that I found fascinating is we think of women sometimes, fairly or not, as being compromisers, conciliators. You pointed out that women are no more immune to partisanship than men are.
I mean, even women say of themselves a lot of times, I'm willing to compromise, I want to, but the reality has been that the party polarization has been so extreme that the women who are getting elected on the Republican side and the women who are getting elected for the most part on the Democratic side are coming from more extreme positions than they were a decade ago. And bipartisanship has not been happening in the Congress for quite a long time. So women aren't going to solve that problem, whether or not some of them want to be conciliators.
All right. Susan Chira, The New York Times, thank you for joining us. And coming up next, political promises easy to make, not always easy to deliver on. How much of the new deBlasio agenda will actually happen? Stick around and find out. Mayor de Blasio delivered his State of the City address earlier this month. He outlined some plans, made a few provocative comments, wants to hike taxes on the rich, expand health care for people without insurance, require paid vacations for private sector employees. He also ripped into big business, said he'd seize the buildings of scofflaw landlords. But what will actually happen and what won't? Let's ask a pair of New York Times reporters who cover the beat, City Hall reporter William Newman and Metro Politics reporter Jeffrey C. Mays. We asked that question during the break, Willie, and you said it's going to be easy. Why is that?
Well, in his State of the City speech, there were really two things that he held up, both in the run-up to this speech and in the speech itself, as the big ideas of the speech. One was this thing that he's been going around characterizing as universal health care, which is very much less than that. Which is essentially a 1% increase in the budget of the Health and Hospitals Corporation to do more public outreach and get more people to come in and use primary care physicians and stuff.
Will that actually help people? And if so, how
Well,
many?
it'll help some people, and they're working both to get more people to sign up for different kinds of insurance, both the city's insurance plan called Metro Plus and both the Obamacare insurance.
Will it provide universal health care in the
Absolutely
city?
not. I mean, already anybody in the city can go to a Health and Hospitals Corporation hospital. So in that sense, people do have access, but it's not what's being called universal health care. And then
Those two proposals cost the mayor almost nothing. This one, Health and Hospitals Corporation proposal was $100 million. The proposal for
Which is almost nothing these days.
Right, compared to the city's budget, and the paid sick time, the paid off time, requiring private employees to provide time off. That's not going to cost the city anything either. So these are two proposals that he can put out there without little cost to the city. In addition, a lot of the other proposals, fixing the subways, some of the other reforms he wants, a lot of the stuff has to come from Albany.
And what is the relationship with Albany now? He has a Democratic Senate for the first time. All the excuses to blame on the Republicans no longer there. Is there any sense of coordinating better with the governor and the legislature, and also particularly on the MTA, which seems to be ping-ponging between Albany and City Hall and between the MTA board and Albany?
Well, there have been some big victories on the DREAM Act, and election laws have been changed. Women's reproductive rights have been protected. But on things like the MTA, the governor is still saying that he wants the city to chip in more money, which the mayor is saying that he doesn't want to do. So in some ways, there's been a little bit of change, and in other things like fighting over the MTA, there's been no change whatsoever.
The mayor is now also a lame duck. He's limited by 2 terms. Lots of people sort of looking over his shoulder to succeed him. Also, there's a public advocate race going on with, what now, 22 people running? Is that what we're up to?
Do we have to go through the whole
We can't go through all the candidates.
I'm not going to test you and ask you to name them all. But, and the mayor is spending more and more time out of town, sort of dipping his toes into national races. Does anyone out there really want him? Or are we being jaded and blinkered because we know him so well, but the rest of the country is really, you know, out there? I don't know what to say.
Well, go ahead.
You go.
All right. Well, as I said to you before, Sam, we're jaded, but we're not too jaded. He has said, before his State of the Union, he said he was going to go out and preach the gospel of liberal government, and especially about these 2 proposals. He's gotten a fair amount of attention for his universal health care proposal, which is not what it is, actually. And he announced it in the Washington Post, where there's a story in the Washington Post. He went on TV to talk about the paid vacation time. What I judge it by is before the election last year, he said that he was going to go around and campaign to help the Democrats win Congress. He took 2 trips, one to Wisconsin to campaign for a congressional candidate there, and one to Florida to campaign for Gillum, who was running for governor. And that was it. There was no clamor of people saying, come to us and help us win our elections. It just didn't happen. So.
And we know what happened the last time around with his endorsement, if you call it that, of Hillary Rodham Clinton. He managed to screw that up. Is he a serious candidate for national office, do you think? Or is he serious in his own mind?
For national office, meaning president?
Well, I guess that's the one.
I don't know. You take that one.
I mean,
John.
you know, anybody can run, right, if you meet the requirements. And I'm sure he's looking at, you know, who's the president now and saying that, you know, if
He's
Donald
saying,
Trump
"I can
be
do that."
president, then I can be president. Look, there hasn't been a lot of calls for him around the country. I think what he's seeing too, you're seeing a new crop of progressive lawmakers in Washington and also in Albany, and the mayor doesn't want to be left out. He thinks he is the original progressive, and that he has promoted a lot of these ideas for a long time. So he's certainly going to go out there and try to put his voice into the mix. How it's received, not sure. It hasn't been received that well in the past.
And of course, there are other jobs. If the Democrats win, there are appointive posts and all sorts of other things like that.
He loves being talked about. I mean, he went on TV and he was asked if he was going to run for president, and he said, I'll never rule it out. And so that's just like an invitation for people to speculate.
I guess so. Even though there were few promises or few major promises in the State of the City speech, there are things that he still has on his agenda. Rikers Island, dealing with the homeless, building more affordable housing, the Housing Authority, and you know, there are other things still pending. Is he going to deliver on those things as well before the second term is over? And are there any new visions for the second term?
I mean, I think the criticism before the state of the city is that there hadn't been many new ideas. He rolled out these two big ideas, but issues like NYCHA, he's been heavily criticized on for not stepping up, not presenting a plan until lead, the exposure of lead was reported, and he didn't really focus on those things in his state of the city. He talked briefly about his plan to help NYCHA, but there was no big rollout of what we're going to do to help the 400, 500,000 people
And that's
who are living in
certainly an
poor
issue that
conditions.
ought to be of concern to progressives.
Right. Absolutely.
And Rikers Island as well. So what is he trying to do in the second term? I mean, besides being out of town, you pointed out that he has been somewhat more accessible.
Well, his big idea from the very beginning was early childhood education. And so he did pre-K, that was successful. He started 3K, and what I've been told, both by him and other people in City Hall, is that in budget talks, he has told his staff, I don't want any other big ticket items in the budget because I want money to keep expanding 3K.
Which is an accomplishment.
Yes, it is. So clearly he's very focused on that, and he will remain focused. The housing thing, he's been able to meet his numbers so far, and presumably will continue to be able to. NYCHA is a problem and a headache, maybe without a solution. Homelessness, he's been treading water on that.
Like his predecessor.
Rikers is a huge lift.
I think the mayor would love nothing more than to be just a big voice on these progressive issues, have people coming to New York City touting his accomplishments. So I think, that's his goal, I believe.
Okay, thanks to William Newman, Jeffrey C. Mays of the New York Times. And coming up ahead, New York is pushing hard to legalize pot. Some major risks, are they being ignored? Governor Cuomo said in his State of the State address he wants to legalize marijuana in New York in the next 100 days. Mayor deBlasio backing the plan. If the plan becomes law, New York would join 10 other states where recreational marijuana is legal. New Jersey getting ready to join the list. But are they ignoring the serious risks of pot? The author of a new book says yes. Alex Berenson, the author of Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. He's also a former New York Times reporter and the author of best-selling thrillers, a former colleague who had an opinion piece in the New York Times about the book. Now you can read the whole book itself. Alex, why this sudden campaign to legalize? Is marijuana any better than it was before?
No, it's much stronger, in fact, than it was before. And
well, to some people, that may be better.
Sure. I think that politicians in the Democratic Party, for the most part, believe that they can't be serious presidential candidates if they don't favor legalization.
That's a long way from not inhaling.
That's true. Governor Cuomo, even last year did not have this attitude. The science has not changed. The science has gotten worse in the last 5 to 10 years, and certainly in the last 20 years. It's amazing how successful the cannabis lobbying effort has been.
What makes it worse? Obviously, people have said, Ben Carey had a piece in the Times too, saying that experts, scientists say the type of marijuana that is out there now much, much stronger than your father's or grandfather's marijuana.
Yeah, so cannabis is stronger based on the THC content. THC is the chemical in it that's responsible for the psychoactive effects that get you high. There's also less of a chemical called CBD, which sort of counteracts CBD. So there are a lot of people out there. I think, I'm 46. I used marijuana a handful of times in college and after. It was relatively weak. I think there's a lot of people in my position, maybe you're in their 50s, or even into their early 40s, late 30s, who don't really have any idea what this drug is now. And certainly people who are adults or who are parents of adolescent or adult children don't have any idea. A lot of people today use what is essentially a semi-synthetic product called a THC that's been extracted from leaves and is smoked in sort of a wax form. It's called wax or shatter. This is a very, very different drug.
You say that you are for decriminalization rather than legalization. If it's so dangerous, why not be for prohibition?
Well, 40 million Americans used cannabis in 2017. We're not going to arrest all of them. We're not going to put them all in jail. And I do understand that the legalization community has raised real issues around arrests of Black and Hispanic young men and women. And so I think reasonably decriminalization is a middle path. This is not a drug that's as dangerous as opioids or cocaine. But it is in no way a safe drug. It's in no way a medicine, and we need to stop pretending that it is those things.
One of the people who wrote the Times in response to your piece said any potential harm caused by marijuana is far outweighed by the harms of prohibition, stigmatization, criminalization. Instead, a system of robust regulation allows for product safety testing, enforcement of age limits for purchase, things like that.
Yeah, unfortunately, the states that have legalized, there's no evidence that that's true, especially when you legalize and permit home grows, when you permit people to grow their own cannabis. Because if you're going to allow people to have, let's say, 12 plants at home, that's much more cannabis than any person can consume. So that creates actually a really low-end black market in untaxed, unregulated cannabis. What legalization definitely does do is create a really loud and powerful community of business interests that are going to fight against warning labels, that are going to fight against reasonable restrictions on this drug.
And when we talk about, as you do in the book, that this drives up the use of marijuana and also perhaps drives up violence, do we know, in fact, there's a causal relationship?
So cannabis causes psychosis. There is no question about that. Tell Your Children is ultimately a book about health and science, and it's about severe mental illness. So cannabis use causes temporary psychosis, according to data from emergency room data that an NYU professor and I analyzed.
Well, Ben Carey in the Times say people with psychotic problems often use cannabis.
But beyond that, cannabis causes temporary psychosis, without question, in healthy people hundreds of times a day in the United States. And the comparisons to, let's say, something like nicotine or caffeine are nonsense. Those drugs do not cause psychosis at anything like the same rate. It also causes, if you have pre-existing mental illness, if you have schizophrenia, it's going to worsen your disease. It's going to cause you to develop it at a younger age. If your schizophrenia is under control, it's very likely to put you back into psychosis. It is a dangerous drug for people with existing mental illness, and there's really good evidence that adolescent cannabis use can drive mental illness in people who wouldn't have otherwise gotten it. In other words, that cannabis can cause schizophrenia.
Tell Your Children the truth about marijuana, mental illness, and violence. You'll be able to tell them that Alex Berenson told you so. I'll add my thoughts on CODA next. Russell Baker died this week. He was 93 and among the last of a generation of newspaper men and women, like Pete Hamill and Jimmy Breslin, the subjects of a new HBO documentary, who, as he put it, performed a ballet in a telephone booth. They elegantly tapped out 700 or so words several times a week within the confines of a column. No coincidence that Baker's column was called Observer. He rarely preached. He viewed the world with what he called an untrusting eye. He told revealing stories he had learned through the lost art of listening. He attributed that in part to having been raised in a big family and pointed out that many kids today are not. If you're destined to have a not very interesting life, and I was so destined, Baker wrote, the next best thing, if you're going to be a writer, is to have a large family. It gives you a chance to learn a lot about humanity from close-up observation. When you're the only pea in the pod, your parents are likely to get you confused with the Hope Diamond, and that encourages you to talk too much. Getting into the habit of talking too much is fine if you're destined to be a lawyer or a politician or an entertainer. But if you're going to be a writer, it's death. Writers have to cultivate the habit early in life of listening to people other than themselves. Not just writers, he also observed this about Congress in what he said, quote, Nobody has any weight, nobody listens in Congress anymore. Baker was wooed by his share of celebrity politicians and power brokers, but he warned against turning deaf ears and closed minds to what you can also learn from shoe leather reporting on the other 99%. Baker wrote, quote, columnists' tendency to spend their time with life's winners and to lead lives of isolation from the less dazzling American realities makes it too easy for us sometimes to solve the nation's problems in 700 words. As James Reston, Baker's columnist colleague, once joked during a newspaper strike, how can I know what I think if I can't read what I write? Baker was often asked how would-be journalists should prep for the job. The ideal journalism school needs only one course, Baker replied. Students should be required to stand outside a closed door for 6 hours. Then the door would open. Someone would put his head around the jamb and say, "No comment." The door would close again, and the students would be required to write 800 words against a deadline. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.